He grabbed her coffee cup right out of her hand, poured it into the dirt at her feet, and laughed. "Wrong table, sweetheart." The recruits behind him erupted. A woman in a duct-tape jacket standing at a Tier 1 sniper range. They thought it was the funniest thing they'd seen all week. What they didn't know was that the woman they were humiliating had already saved the life of one of the men laughing at her, and she hadn't said a word about it in 3 years. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The Nevada Sun doesn't ask permission. It doesn't ease you in or give you a warning. It arrives like a sentence, absolute, unforgiving, and without appeal. By 7 in the morning, the air at Fort Fallon's Joint Special Operations Command training range already felt like something scraped off the inside of an engine block. The kind of heat that didn't just make you sweat, it made you think, made you reconsider, made you question whether the body you were living in was actually built for this, or whether you'd just been lying to yourself for years. The recruits standing in formation along the firing line had not been lying to themselves. Not yet. They were the best of what their respective branches had sent forward. Army Rangers, Marine Force, Recon, Navy, Special Operations candidates, all of them screened and selected and pushed through training pipelines that had broken dozens of men before them. They were proud of that. They had earned the right to be proud of that. But pride in the wrong hands at the wrong moment becomes something dangerous. And that morning, the pride packed into that firing line was loaded like a weapon with the safety already off. Sergeant First Class Derek Hollis, 29 years old. Army Ranger, stood at the far left of the line and rolled his neck until something cracked. He was 6 feet 2 jaw, like a concrete ledge, the kind of man who had spent his whole life being told he was exceptional and had taken that information seriously. He had a long-range shooting record that his unit passed around like a trophy. He had a voice that he used like a battering ram, loud, confident, designed to dominate whatever room he walked into. The man standing beside him was Lance Corporal James Rourke, Marine Force Recon, younger by 4 years, quieter by nature, but carrying the same current underneath that electrical certainty of someone who had never truly been humbled. Rourke was a sniper's sniper. Clean technique, sharp instincts, the kind of patience that made instructors nod in approval. But patience in a controlled environment and patience when everything is falling apart are two entirely different animals. And nobody on that firing line had been forced to meet the second version of themselves yet. The others stood in various postures of readiness, some checking equipment, some talking quietly, some staring downrange where the steel targets waited at distances that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago and now just seemed like another Tuesday. They were good. They knew they were good, and that knowing sat on all of them like an extra layer of armor. Captain Alan Mitchell walked the line. He was the kind of officer who didn't explain himself twice. Gray at the temples, face weathered to something between leather and stone eyes that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. He moved without urgency because urgency for Mitchell was a choice, something deployed deliberately, not leaked out by accident. He reviewed clipboards, made small notations, spoke in short sentences that landed like instructions carved into rock. "Winds running east-northeast," he said to no one in particular. "Shifting. That's your first problem today. Your second problem is yourselves. Figure out which one's harder to control." Nobody laughed. Mitchell didn't invite laughter. What happened next, though, nobody had planned for that. She appeared at the edge of the range, the way certain things appear in desert landscapes, without announcement, without build-up, as if she had simply always been there, and everyone else had just stopped paying attention. She was standing maybe 30 feet from the firing line off to the side, near the equipment crates that lined the access road. She wasn't in formation. She wasn't introduced. She was just there. She was a woman somewhere in her late 30s, average height, not physically imposing in any way that would have triggered alarm. She wore BDU pants that had seen better years, boots that were broken in, past the point most people would have thrown them away, and a military jacket that looked like it had been repaired with duct tape in at least 3 places along the left shoulder and the collar. No rank displayed, no unit patch. Nothing identifying her beyond the simple fact that she was standing at a JSOC training facility and somehow no one had removed her. She had a cup of coffee from the range's field station. She held it in both hands, not drinking it, just holding it. Like the warmth of the cup was enough. She was watching the targets. Derek Hollis saw her first. "Hey," he said, lowering his voice just enough to keep it between the men nearby. Who brought their mom? The laugh that rippled through the nearest cluster of recruits was immediate and low, the kind of laugh that feeds on itself that gets louder the more people join in. Rourke caught it and smiled without quite committing the way people do when they're not sure how far something is going to go. Seriously, Hollis continued, voice rising now because the first laugh had given him permission. Is that a contractor? What branch is she from? The branch that repairs gear with hardware store tape. More laughter, louder now. She didn't react, didn't turn her head, didn't shift her weight. Her eyes stayed on the steel targets 1,000 yards away. She raised the coffee cup, took one slow sip, and lowered it again. Nothing on her face changed. That stillness, that absolute refusal to react, seemed to bother Hollis more than any response would have. He turned toward her, slightly raising his voice to a register that was designed to carry. Hey, lady, this is a restricted training range. Are you sure you're in the right place? She glanced at him, one glance, the kind that measures something and then puts it aside. Then she looked back at the targets. Hollis looked at the men around him, hands out at his sides in a what is happening gesture. She can't even answer a question. Cap, is she one of ours? Because if she is, we've got a readiness problem. Captain Mitchell, 20 feet down the line, didn't look up from his clipboard. Carry on, Hollis. That was all. Hollis took the silence as permission. He always took silence as permission. I'm just saying someone let the wrong person through the gate. No offense, ma'am, but you look like you got dressed in the supply room after a flood. Is that tape holding your jacket together? She turned then. Not sharply, slowly, the way someone turns when they've decided something, not when they've been startled. She looked at Hollis with an expression that contained no anger, no embarrassment, no need to prove anything. It was the expression of someone watching, weather observing, measuring unattached to outcome. You're overcorrecting for elevation, she said. Her voice was level, unhurried. At this temperature, with this air density, your listed dope for the 1,500-yard line is going to run you high and right. You'll need to adjust your come-ups. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of confusion, followed immediately by the silence of offense. Hollis stared at her for a moment. Then he laughed, the bright, dismissive laugh of someone who has decided that what they just heard doesn't require serious consideration. She knows what dope means, he said to Rourke. Impressive. Did you Google that last night, sweetheart, or do you own a rifle? Rourke kept his smile carefully neutral. Something had shifted in the back of his mind, something he couldn't name yet, something that said slow down, but his mouth didn't always listen to that part of his brain. She set her coffee cup down on top of one of the equipment crates. Deliberate. Unhurried. Then she folded her hands and looked at Hollis with those same measuring eyes. Do you want to check your data or not? My data is fine, Hollis said. My data has been working for 6 years. My data put rounds on target in 3 different countries. But thank you for the input. 3 countries, she said quietly. Good. Something in the way she said it, not sarcastic, not dismissive, just acknowledging as if 3 countries was a starting point rather than an achievement, landed wrong in Hollis's chest. He didn't know why. He pushed it away. Cap, he called out. Are we going to get started, or are we doing a public education segment first? Mitchell finally looked up. He looked at the woman by the equipment crates. Something crossed his face, something that none of the recruits had vocabulary for yet. Not exactly deference, not exactly tension, something more like awareness, like a man who understood exactly what was in the room with him and was choosing his words accordingly. Sergeant Hollis, Mitchell said, you've got a round to fire. I suggest you fire it. The drilling resumed. Recruits settled into positions. Spotters called wind calculations were cross-checked. The woman remained where she was watching. Hollis fired his round, high and right. He worked his bolt rechecked. His data muttered something about wind call. His spotter made an adjustment. He fired again. Closer, but still not where it needed to be. From across the range, without raising her voice, the woman said, You're chasing it. Stop chasing. The wind shifted 2 minutes ago. You're correcting for a condition that doesn't exist anymore. Hollis lowered his weapon and looked at her. His jaw was tight now. The easy humor had calcified into something harder. I don't know who you are or what you think you're doing here, but this is a training evaluation, not a coaching session. So unless someone with actual authority tells me to listen to you, I'd appreciate if you'd find somewhere else to be. You hit 11 inches high and 4 right on your last shot, she said. Your first round was worse. At 1,500 yards, that's not a miss. That's a death. Whoever you were supposed to protect is gone, and you're standing here arguing about authority. The range went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the sound of the wind. Rourke had stopped moving. His hands were still on his rifle, but his attention was entirely elsewhere. He was watching her face. Something about the way she'd said it, not as a reprimand, not even as a correction, but as a fact stated with the flat certainty of someone who had lived inside that failure before, had reached him in a place that Hollis's bravado couldn't access. Hollis, however, was not Rourke. "Lady," he said, voice dropping to a register that he used when he wanted people to understand that he was done being polite. "I don't know where you served or if you served or what you think gives you the standing to walk onto my range and start offering corrections, but you are wearing a jacket held together with tape and you don't have a rank visible, which tells me everything I need to know about what table you're sitting at. So with all due respect, which I want to be clear, is not very much back off." She picked up her coffee cup again, took another sip. The cup was almost certainly cold by now. "Your come-up data is wrong," she said. "So is your attitude. One of those you can fix with a data card. The other one is going to get someone killed." And then she just stopped, looked back at the targets, as if the conversation was over because she'd said what needed saying and the rest was up to him. Hollis turned to Mitchell. "Cap, I need you to tell me who this person is and why she's standing on my range telling me how to shoot." Mitchell lowered his clipboard. He looked at Hollis for a long, quiet moment, the kind of moment that a good officer uses deliberately, letting silence do the work that words might do too loudly. "She's here as an observer," Mitchell said finally. "Continue your drills." "An observer," Hollis repeated. "An observer in a taped-up jacket is correcting my shooting data." "Sergeant, continue your drills." Hollis turned back to the firing line. His face was hard. His hands were precise. He reset, recalculated, and this time because some part of him that was still rational, still honest, was listening despite everything else. He applied the adjustments she had described. The round hit, dead center. The steel rang out across the desert like a struck bell, clean and loud and impossible to argue with. He lay behind the rifle for 3 seconds without moving. Nobody said anything. Nobody laughed. He came off the rifle, stood up, and looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was already watching the next recruit take position. Her expression unchanged, the coffee cup back in both hands, eyes tracking the target line. Rourke leaned toward him slightly, voice just above a whisper. "You going to say thank you?" Hollis's jaw moved. Nothing came out. He turned back to the line, picked up his rifle, and didn't say another word for 40 minutes. But he kept watching her. They all kept watching her. Because there was something about the way she stood, not military straight, not rigid, but settled like a person who had found the ground and knew exactly where her weight was, that didn't fit the story they had written about her. She didn't move like a contractor. She didn't watch the range like a civilian. She watched it the way hunters watch open ground, quietly, comprehensively, processing everything at once, without appearing to focus on anything specifically. The next drill began. Targets at over 1,000 yards, shifting wind, unreliable thermals, the kind of conditions that made experienced shooters humble. A recruit from the Navy element, Petty Officer Second Class Torres, was struggling. He had technique, solid fundamentals, but he was fighting the conditions instead of working with them. His shots were landing in the vicinity of where they needed to be, but vicinity wasn't good enough. Vicinity meant the difference between mission success and catastrophe. He cursed quietly, adjusted, fired again. Still off. She walked over. She didn't ask permission. She stood beside him at a distance that was professional but direct, and she watched his position for a moment. "You're rushing your breath control," she said. "You're slowing down at the wrong point in the cycle. You're controlling for the shot instead of releasing into it." Torres looked up at her. Unlike Hollis, he didn't have the rank or the years of reinforced confidence. He was good, but he was still young enough to hear things. "How do I fix it?" "Stop thinking about the shot. Think about the exhale. The shot happens after the exhale. You're thinking about them at the same time, which means your brain is running 2 programs when it should be running 1. Torres nodded slowly. He resettled, breathed, let the exhale run its full length. The shot happened somewhere in that space, almost like a surprise. The steel rang. Torres exhaled again, this time with relief instead of technique. He looked up at her. That's right. Every time, she said, and she walked back to her spot by the equipment crates. Hollis had watched the whole thing. His expression had gone through several changes that he was working hard to keep off his face. What was settling in his chest now was not quite anger anymore. It was something more uncomfortable than anger. It was the early unwelcome feeling of being wrong about something you'd been certain about. He didn't like it. He had no experience being comfortable with it. He waited until the drill rotation brought him close enough to Rourke, then spoke low and fast. I need to know who she is. Mitchell's not telling us anything. That's deliberate. Yeah, Rourke said. His voice was slower than usual, more careful. I noticed. Look at her hands, Hollis said. Rourke had already looked. He'd been looking. The woman's hands were steady in a way that went beyond training the steadiness of someone who had operated in conditions that trained the stillness into the body permanently, the way cold trains itself into old bone. And there was something on her left forearm, a fragment of ink visible below the sleeve of the jacket. He couldn't make it out, but it was there. Mitchell's protecting her, Rourke said quietly, which means she's something. She's wearing tape on her jacket, Hollis said, but his voice had lost conviction. Yeah, Rourke said. She is. He didn't say anything else, but his eyes stayed on her for the rest of the drill rotation, and whatever he was thinking it carefully. By midday, the atmosphere on the range had changed in ways that were hard to quantify, but impossible to ignore. The early laughter was gone. The posturing had cooled. Not because anyone had spoken directly about what was happening, no one had, but because the woman by the equipment crates had demonstrated, without ever raising her voice or making a single theatrical gesture, that she understood what was happening on this firing line at a level that was uncomfortable to be around when you thought you knew everything. She had corrected 4 different recruits over the course of the morning. Each correction had been delivered in the same register, quiet, direct, precise, without condescension. Each correction had been right. Each one had produced a better shot. And each one had made it slightly harder for the men on the line to maintain the narrative they'd constructed about her. The narrative required her to be incompetent. The evidence wasn't cooperating. Hollis ate his midday ration sitting on an equipment case, watching her from across the range. She was reviewing something, a small notebook, handwritten pages worn at the corners. Not a device, not a digital tool, handwritten. Like someone who had spent years in environments where batteries died and screens cracked, and the only thing you could trust was paper and the arithmetic you'd done yourself. He thought about asking her name. He thought about apologizing. He rejected both options, not because he didn't recognize them as right, but because he was a man who had built his identity out of never being wrong, and he wasn't yet ready to start that demolition project. That would come later, but it was coming. He could feel it moving toward him, the way weather moves across open desert. Slow at first, then faster than you thought possible, and by the time you see it clearly, you're already standing inside it. By early afternoon, Mitchell gathered the recruits for a briefing. They stood in a loose formation, hydrating, wiping heat from their faces, grateful for the pause, even if none of them would admit it. The woman stood at the edge of the group, not in it, at the edge. Mitchell looked at the recruits for a long moment. He had the habit on days like this of letting silence work first. This afternoon, he said, we're moving to a new exercise, long-range shooting under degraded conditions. Wind variance, thermal distortion, psychological stress component. You'll be working in teams, but individual performance will be scored. He paused. Sergeant Hollis, you want to demonstrate what I mean by psychological stress component? Hollis straightened. Sir, you spent most of this morning telling the observer near the equipment crates that she didn't belong here. Mitchell's voice was completely flat, informational. How many of your corrections did she get right this morning? The silence on the range was absolute. Even the wind seemed to slow. Hollis took one breath. All of them, sir. Say that again. All of them, sir. Mitchell nodded, once. Slow. Yeah, he looked at the group. Psychological stress component begins now. Good luck this afternoon. He turned and started walking away, then stopped without turning back. Oh, the observer's name is Miller. Senior Chief Petty Officer Miller. She'll be running the afternoon session. He kept walking. And Hollis stood in the heat of the Nevada sun, holding the specific weight of every word he had said that morning, wondering for the first time in longer than he could remember whether the problem had never been the win, whether the problem had always been him. She stepped forward from the edge of the group, the torn jacket, the duct tape, the cold coffee cup. She looked at the recruits the way she had been looking at the targets all morning, measuring processing unattached to what they thought of the process. "Drink your water," she said. "We start in 10 minutes. And not one of them argued. 10 minutes passed the way 10 minutes pass when nobody wants them to end too fast and carrying too much weight on the way out. The recruits had hydrated, they had repositioned, they had done the small physical things that men do when they need to reset their internal state without admitting that their internal state needs resetting. Checked their gear, retied boots that didn't need retying, adjusted optics that were already dialed in. The hands stay busy when the mind is working on something it hasn't solved yet. Hollis stood at the far end of the firing line. He hadn't spoken since Mitchell walked away. That, for anyone who knew Derek Hollis, was the loudest possible signal that something real was happening inside him. He was a man who filled silence the way water fills a container, instinctively, completely, without thinking about it. But right now, the silence was filling him instead. And he didn't know what to do with that. Rourke watched him from 2 positions down. He had the look of a man running calculations that had nothing to do with ballistics. Senior Chief Petty Officer Miller stood at the center of the range. She had set her coffee cup down somewhere and hadn't picked it up again. She held nothing. Her hands were at her sides, loose, easy, the kind of stillness that isn't practiced, but earned. She looked at the recruits the way a person looks at a map before a long trip, not intimidated by the distance, just oriented to it. "We're changing the exercise," she said, her voice carried without effort. "Clean, direct, no performance in it. The afternoon isn't about your technique. Your technique is fine. Some of it is better than fine. What we're testing now is whether your technique survives contact with the conditions you can't control." She paused. Nobody moved. "You've been shooting in a bad wind all morning. You know the wind is bad. You've been accounting for it consciously, deliberately, like you're solving a math problem. That works when you have time. That works when your heart rate is below 100 and your hands are dry and you slept last night." Another pause. "We're going to find out what you do when none of those things are true." Hollis looked up. "And how exactly are we going to simulate that?" She looked at him. "Level. By making you earn the right to get behind the rifle." The afternoon began. What she designed was not elegant. It wasn't supposed to be. She ran them through a physical stress circuit first, not PT, for its own sake, not punishment disguised as training, but a deliberate physiological disruption. Sprints in the heat, short recovery windows, body weight stress under time pressure, but designed to push heart rates into ranges where fine motor control starts to deteriorate, and the voice in the back of the head that says, "You've got this," starts to sound uncertain. Recruits who had spent the morning looking composed began to look like what they were, human beings operating at the outer edge of their capacity. After 22 minutes, she called them to the line. "You have 60 seconds to settle your breathing and make your shot," she said, walking behind the positions. 60 seconds. Clock starts when you get behind the rifle. Go. The first recruit down, a ranger named Alvarez, got into position and immediately rushed. Heart rate still, high hands not fully under control, he fired before his breath cycle had completed. The shot went wide. Not by much, but wide. 60 seconds is enough time, she said, not stopping as she walked. If you use it, you use 12. Alvarez said nothing. He knew. Torres was next. The Navy man who had listened to her earlier in the morning, who had adjusted his breath control and heard the steel ring. He got down and she watched him work through exactly what she had told him. Exhale first shot. Second, think about one thing at a time. His heart rate was visible in the slight shake of his rifle barrel. He let the exhale go long, let it carry him forward into the moment, and the shot happened in the space on the other side. The steel rang. Torres stayed down for 1 second, breathing. Then he looked up, and the look on his face was not triumph, it was recognition. The particular recognition of someone who has just confirmed something they suspected about themselves. She nodded once, kept moving. Hollis was fourth in rotation. He came off the stress circuit, breathing hard, jaw-locked hands that were almost but not completely steady. He got behind the rifle with 38 seconds on the clock. He ran his check, data confirmed position, set target acquired. The wind had shifted again since morning. He could feel it. He didn't need a tool to tell him. He had spent enough time on enough ranges in enough bad conditions to feel the pressure change the way some people feel rain coming. He made his adjustment, committed to it, let his breathing find the bottom of its arc. 23 seconds left. He fired. The steel rang. He stayed down. He didn't celebrate. He didn't look at her. But his hands when he came back off the rifle were slightly less tight than they had been before the shot, as if the shot had released something. She stopped walking behind him. Wind shifted 4 seconds before you fired. You caught it. He looked straight ahead. Yeah. How? He was quiet for a moment. Felt it on my neck. She was quiet too, for exactly long enough that he knew she was actually thinking about his answer, rather than just waiting for it to end. That's not something you learn from a data card, she said. He didn't respond. That's instinct, she said, which means the ability was already in you. The question is whether the attitude was letting it operate or blocking it. She moved on before he could decide what to do with that, which was, he would realize later, the exact right timing. Give a man something real and then walk away before he can argue with it. Let it sit. Let it do its work without interference. The exercise continued. Round after round, recruit after recruit, the pattern revealing itself. The ones who had come into the morning with the most confidence were struggling the most with the stress component, because confidence in that version was load-bearing. It was holding things up that should have been standing on their own. Under pressure, when the confidence shook, everything it had been propping up shook with it. The ones who had been quieter, more uncertain about themselves, had less to lose. They got lower, steadier, faster. Because when you're not defending a narrative about yourself, you can actually pay attention to what's in front of you. Rourke was one of those. He came off the circuit, got behind his rifle, and went so still, so fast that 2 recruits next to him glanced over without meaning to. His shot was clean. Center. The kind of shot that looks almost boring in its precision until you account for everything that was working against it. She stopped behind him. He didn't look up. He was still in the position, running his bolts, setting up a second hypothetical. Again, she asked. If there's time, he said. There's time. He fired again. Same result. She crouched behind him, not over his shoulder, beside him at his level. Where did you train long range before the pipeline? Montana, he said. My grandfather had land. We shot deer from 800-900 yards. Wine there makes this look like a swimming pool. How old were you? 12 when I started, 14 when I actually got good. She was quiet for a moment. The best shooters I've worked with weren't built in a range. They were built somewhere where it mattered before they were old enough to be afraid of mattering. Rourke finally looked at her. This close, he could see what the distance of the morning had hidden, the lines at the corners of her eyes that weren't age exactly, but something denser. The way her jaw sat, not hard, but settled like a structure that had been tested and had held. The left forearm visible now, the sleeve of the jacket pushed back slightly by the crouch. He could see the ink clearly for the first time. He recognized it. Not fully, not with certainty, but enough. A fragment of a design that he had seen before once in a briefing that he was not supposed to discuss outside of the specific room it had been held in. A frog skull. Skeletal, aggressive, unmistakable to anyone who had been inside that particular compartment of the military world. His throat tightened. He looked back at the target. Okay, he said very quietly. Not to her, just into the air. The word that comes out when something you suspected has been confirmed and you need a second to process it. She stood back up and kept walking. He lay behind his rifle for a long time after she left. Not shooting, just thinking. The afternoon had been running for 2 hours when the first crack appeared in the group's collective resistance. Not a dramatic moment, not a confrontation. Just a slow geological shift, the kind that happens in training when the instruction is good enough to get past the defenses the students didn't know they were running. They were asking her questions, not challenging her, asking. Recruits who 6 hours earlier had laughed at the duct tape on her jacket were now leaning in when she made a correction, following her logic, applying it in real time. The range had become hers in a way that nobody had formally authorized, and nobody needed to. Authority, the real kind, doesn't need a signature. It establishes itself in the space between what someone knows and what everyone else wishes they knew. Hollis watched it happening. He watched his fellow recruits turning toward her the way plants turn toward light, not because they decided to, but because the light was simply where the useful information was coming from. He watched Torres take a third shot at a distance he'd been struggling with all morning and put it exactly where it needed to go. And he watched the look on Torres's face, the look of someone discovering something true about themselves, and he recognized it from his own shot 40 minutes earlier, and he felt deep in his chest something shift. It was not a good feeling. Not yet. Real change rarely feels good at the beginning. At the beginning, it just feels like losing something you thought you needed. He walked toward her during a rotation break. He walked like a man who had decided to do something before he could talk himself out of it. She was standing near the equipment crates again, writing in that small notebook. He stopped 5 feet from her. "Miller," he said. She looked up. "Senior Chief," he said, correcting himself, deliberately, letting the rank land the way it deserved to. "I want to ask you about the ballistic adjustment from this morning, the one I should have made before you told me." She studied him for a moment, looking for something. He wasn't sure what. "What about it? How far out were you calculating? Were you accounting for the suppressor's effect on muzzle velocity at that temperature range, or were you running base data?" Something in her expression changed. Not much. A fraction of a degree of something that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same family. "Base data," she said. "The suppressor at that temperature runs within acceptable variance. If you'd been over 1,400 yards, I'd have adjusted for it. At 1,500, I'd have given you a specific number." He nodded, processed. "Okay." He looked at the ground for a moment and then back at her. "I had the wrong attitude this morning." She said nothing. "I'm not apologizing because I think you need it," he said, and his voice was doing something unfamiliar, being honest without a script, without a layer of performance over the top of it. "I'm saying it because it affected the training environment and that's on me." She held his as it took a long moment. "The adjustment this morning, did you apply it?" "Yeah." "Did it work?" "Yeah." "Then we're good," she said, and she looked back down at her notebook. He stood there for one more second. "Why the jacket?" he asked. She didn't look up. "What?" "The jacket, the tape. You obviously don't need the gear to establish authority. You proved that today. So why the jacket?" She was quiet for a moment, writing something. Then she looked up, and there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, not sadder exactly, more present, like she'd decided to actually show up inside the answer instead of just delivering it. "Because what you were doing this morning, the evaluation you were running on me the second you saw me, I needed to see it. I needed to see who in this group would think they already knew everything before the day started." She paused. "I needed to know which of you I couldn't trust a mile from the wire when conditions went sideways." The weight of that landed on him completely, not like a strike, like something settling, heavy and permanent and impossible to unlearn. "And," he said, his voice was quieter than he intended, "and some of you surprised me," she said, "for better or worse." She looked back at her notebook. "Get some water, Sergeant." He walked back to the line. He didn't speak to anyone. He picked up his water, drank it slowly, and stood looking down range for a long time. Rourke came up beside him. "What did she say?" "That the jacket was a test," Hollis said. Rourke was quiet for a moment. "For what?" "For exactly what we did." Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The range worked around them, the noise of rifles, the calling of wind, the ring of steel when someone got it right. The sound of people operating at the edge of their capacity and occasionally breaking through to something better on the other side. Then Rourke said quietly, watching her as she moved back to the line, "Hollis, I think I know who she is." Hollis turned. "I saw something on her arm," Rourke said. "This morning, a tattoo." "What kind?" Rourke looked at him, and his face had the expression of a man who is choosing his words because the wrong ones might sound insane. "The kind you only get if you're in a very specific place," he said, "doing a very specific thing for a very long time." Hollis stared at him. "You're sure?" "No," Rourke said, "but I don't think I'm wrong." They both looked at her, Senior Chief Petty Officer Miller, standing at the firing line in her duct-tape jacket, correcting a recruit's breathing, with 3 quiet words, watching the steel ring 1,000 yards away. She looked ordinary. She looked like someone who hadn't slept enough and hadn't eaten enough and had been carrying something heavy for a long time without mentioning it. She looked like someone you could underestimate. They were not going to underestimate her again. The sun was lower now, cutting sideways across the range, turning the light orange and long shadowed. The heat had pulled back 2 degrees, barely noticeable to anyone not paying attention, but the kind of shift that changed trajectories at distance in ways that accumulated. She had noticed. She always noticed. She was watching the last rotation of recruits work through the stress exercise when Captain Mitchell appeared at the edge of the range. He stood beside her for a moment, not speaking, watching the same thing she was watching. "How are they?" he asked. "Some of them are real," she said. "More than I expected." "Which ones?" She was quiet for a moment. "Rourke, Torres, possibly Hollis if he can get out of his own way. And the others. They'll be good soldiers," she said. "Some of them will be great soldiers. Whether any of them will be what you need for Africa is a different question." Mitchell nodded. He was watching Hollis now, who was moving through the stress circuit with a different quality of effort than the morning, not harder but more honest, the way effort looks when the ego isn't managing it anymore. "He asked me about the jacket," she said. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." Mitchell almost smiled. "How'd he take it?" "About how you'd expect," she said. "But he'll be all right." She looked back at the firing line. The last recruit was settling into position, working through the breath cycle, finding the still point in the middle of a body that was running hot and tired. The shot broke clean, and the steel rang out across the desert, and in the particular silence that followed, that specific half-second of held breath, before anyone reacted, she closed her eyes. Just for that half-second, just long enough to be somewhere else entirely, to hear a different steel, in a different wind, in a sky that was not orange but gray with sand miles from here, years from here, in a moment that nobody in this group knew about yet. She opened her eyes. The recruit on the line was already up looking at her for the reaction. She gave him a nod, single, clean, honest. "Good," she said, and then she reached up slowly, deliberately, and began to remove the jacket. The jacket came off slowly, not because she was performing, not because she wanted the moment to build the way it built. She removed it slowly because her left shoulder, the one that had been operated on twice and would never move quite right again, required that she remove it slowly. It was a private accommodation she had made with her own body, a negotiation, not a defeat. The jacket came off and she folded it once, tucked it under her arm, and turned back to the firing line. And the range stopped. Not all at once. One by one, like a current being cut, recruits who had been adjusting optics set down their tools. Men in the middle of loading stopped. Mid-motion conversations went quiet mid-sentence. One by one they turned, because the human animal is wired to pay attention when something in the environment shifts, and something in the environment had shifted completely. What they saw was not what they expected. What they saw was not what any narrative they had constructed about this woman could have prepared them for. Her arms were bare to the short sleeve of the tactical undershirt beneath the jacket. And what was on those arms, what was on her skin from the curve of her left shoulder blade, visible at the sleeve line to the forearm that Rourke had caught a fragment of that morning, was not decoration. It was a record. The marks of someone who had been in the world in a specific and irrevocable way and had come back from it carrying the proof in her own skin. The scars were not theatrical. That was the thing that hit. First, they were not the kind of thing you see in movies, clean and photogenic, placed for dramatic effect. They were real, which meant they were irregular, layered. Some of them faded to a silver white that spoke of years of distance from the original injury, others still carrying a color that said the healing had not been simple. There was a burn scar along the right forearm. There was a long, thin surgical line on the left bicep that ran parallel to the bone, precisely positioned in a way that said someone who knew exactly what they were doing had gone in there for a specific reason and had not made mistakes. There was a pattern of smaller marks on the back of the right hand, not a cluster from a single event, but a distribution, the kind of spread that comes from shrapnel, from being close to something that came apart. But what stopped Rourke cold, what made him take one involuntary step forward before he caught himself, was the tattoo on the left forearm. Fully visible now, no longer a fragment. Complete. The bone frog. Devgru. SEAL Team 6. The skull of a frog, grinning and skeletal, rendered in black ink with a particular detail that told you it was not a copy, not a piece of flash art pulled from a shop wall, but something designed for someone by someone who knew exactly what it needed to mean. Below it a date, and below the date 3 words in small capitals that he had to lean forward to read. He read them, he straightened up, and he said nothing for a long time. Alvarez, standing to his left, said it before anyone else did. Quietly, as if he wasn't sure he should, "Is that a bone frog?" Nobody answered him. Hollis was standing very still. The expression on his face had done something that faces rarely do in public. It had just become completely honest. No performance, no management, no controlled surface, just a man looking at something that was recalibrating his entire morning. She had turned back into the firing line. She set the folded jacket on top of the equipment crate, pulled up her notebook, and looked at the recruits as if none of what had just happened required acknowledgement. "Next rotation," she said. "Torres Alvarez, Petty Officer Kim, get into position." Nobody moved. She looked up from the notebook. "I said next rotation." Hollis spoke. His voice was different from anything it had been all day, stripped down without the performance architecture he normally ran. "Senior Chief, that's a bone frog." "Yes," she said. "DEVGRU." "Yes." The single syllables landed like stones dropped into still water. The ripples went out and kept going. "You're Team 6, Hollis said. Not a question, a recognition. The kind a man makes when the ground has just finished moving under his feet and he's trying to determine if it's stopped. She held his eyes. "I was," she said, and then precisely enough to be unmistakable until I wasn't. Mitchell appeared at the edge of the group again. He had been watching from a distance since the jacket came off. He walked forward now, hands behind his back, unhurried, and the recruits parted without being asked. He stopped beside her, looked at the group, and let the silence run for 5 more seconds deliberately, the way Mitchell did everything deliberately. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Cassidy Miller," he said. "United States Navy, former Naval Special Warfare Development Group, SEAL Team 6, designated sniper classified operations, 15 years of active service under JSOC authority. Her operational record is classified at a level most of you will never be briefed into." He paused. "What you can know is that she is the reason you are training at this specific range using the specific parameters you have been using today, and that the evaluation you have been undergoing since this morning is hers, not mine." Nobody spoke. "She designed this assessment," Mitchell continued. "She runs it, and she has the final word on who passes and who doesn't." He looked at Hollis for exactly 1 second longer than he looked at anyone else. "Any questions?" There were no questions. There was only the sound of the desert wind and the specific quality of silence that comes when a group of people are simultaneously processing the same difficult information. Torres raised his hand halfway. Not fully, like he wasn't sure it was allowed. "The name," he said. "I've heard there's a name, a call sign that people use for." He stopped, because the thing he was about to say sounded out loud in the Nevada sun like something from a story rather than a briefing room. Mitchell looked at him. "You've heard of the Wraith." It wasn't a question either. Torres lowered his hand. "Yeah," he said quietly. Miller was looking at the target line. Her jaw was set in the particular way it's set when she was deciding how much of herself to give to a moment. The bone frog on her forearm caught the late afternoon light and held it. "I don't use that name," she said without turning around. "Other people use it." "Why?" Torres asked. She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, "Because the person who earned it isn't someone I spend a lot of time thinking about. Thinking about her doesn't help me do the job in front of me." The answer was so clean, so stripped of anything theatrical, that it took several seconds to understand what it was costing her to say it. Rourke understood first. He understood because he had spent the last several hours watching her, and what he had been watching without the vocabulary for it until now was a woman who had placed something enormous in a room she didn't visit often, and who operated out of the discipline of not visiting it, not because she was afraid of it, but because the mission was always in front of her and the past was always behind, and conflating. The two was how good people got killed. He respected that in a way that had nothing to do with rank or record. "Torres Alvarez Kim," she said again, steadier this time. "Positions." They moved. This time they moved immediately, and the way they moved was different, not faster, but more considered, more deliberate. As if the ground they were walking on had gained weight, and they were adjusting their stride accordingly. The training resumed, but the atmosphere of it had been fundamentally altered in a way that no amount of technique instruction could have produced. The recruits were not just running drills now. They were running drills in front of someone whose arms told a story their training manuals had no chapter for. And that changed the effort. It changed the intention behind the effort. Because there is a difference, an enormous qualitative difference between trying to perform well for someone who might know what they're doing and trying to perform well for someone who has already paid the price for not performing well in their own body in classified locations and conditions you cannot imagine. Hollis got behind his rifle for the last rotation of the day and lay there for a long moment before he began his pre-shot routine. He was looking at the target, a steel plate, at 1,140 yards, slightly elevated in a wind that had been shifting unpredictably for the last 20 minutes. He ran his data, he checked his position, and then he did something he did not normally do. He stopped thinking. Not checked out, not vacant, just quiet. The way she had been quiet all morning by the equipment crates. The way she had held the coffee cup without drinking it, just holding the warmth. He stopped the internal running commentary, stopped the performance of being someone who knew what he was doing and just was behind the rifle. With the wind, with the distance, with the task. He fired. The steel rang at 1,140 yards. Perfect. He came off the rifle and he didn't look at anyone. He looked at the target and he thought for the first time all day about what it meant to hit it. Not as a score, not as a record. As a consequence, the real-world consequence, that the training was preparing them for the reason the steel mattered, the lives that lived inside the abstract mathematics of wind and elevation and trigger break. He thought about that for a long time. She came up behind him. She had been watching. Of course she had been watching. That was different, she said. Yeah, he said. From the first shot or from this morning, he thought about it. Both. She crouched beside him the same way she had crouched beside Rourke during the stress exercise at his level. Not over him, close enough to speak quietly. He could see her forearm from this angle. The bone frog, the date beneath it. Can I ask what the date is, he said. She looked at the tattoo. Her expression didn't change exactly. But something in the quality of her stillness went from the still of a person at rest to the still of a person holding something. Operation in southern Yemen, she said. 2019. He nodded. He didn't ask more. He could tell she had given him about exactly what she was willing to give, and that asking for more would be taking something that wasn't offered. Is that when he started? Yes, she said, simply, without elaboration. He nodded again. They were both quiet, looking downrange, two people on the other side of a morning that had covered enormous territory. Then she said quietly enough that only he could hear it, "You could have shot like that at 7 this morning." He closed his eyes for 1 second. Yeah, he said, I know. What was in the way? He opened his eyes. He looked at the target still and distant. Me, he said. She stood up. She didn't offer absolution. She didn't tell him it was okay, or that he'd learned something valuable, or that the morning hadn't mattered. She just stood up, and the silence was cleaner for what had been said inside it. Take 15, she told the group, then we debrief. The recruits moved, some sitting, some standing, some doing the small physical unwinding that the body demands after hours of sustained concentration. The light was shifting now into the lower register of late afternoon golden and direct, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's being remembered rather than happening in real time. Rourke sat on an equipment case and looked at his hands. He was thinking about the 3 words he had read beneath the date on her forearm tattoo. He was thinking about them in a way that he couldn't stop thinking about them, the way a phrase sticks when it contains something true that you haven't seen stated before. He looked up when she walked past him. Senior Chief? She stopped. The words under the date, he said. On the tattoo. Can I ask what they say? She looked at him for a moment. Then she held out her forearm, tilted slightly toward him. He leaned forward and read them again, confirming what he'd seen. We hold the line. He sat back, nodded, said nothing because nothing needed to be said. She lowered her arm and kept walking. Alvarez, sitting nearby, had half heard the exchange. He looked at Rourke. What did it say? Rourke looked at him. We hold the line. Alvarez let that sit for a moment. Huh, he said quietly. The kind of sound a person makes when something has fit into a space they didn't know was empty. The debrief was not what they expected. They had expected critique, a systematic review of performance correction scoring. What they got was different. She stood in front of them with her notebook, closed jacket still folded on the equipment crate, and she looked at them one by one, not quickly, not as a performance, but actually looked the way you look at people when you're genuinely trying to understand what's in front of you. You all did something today that most people can't do, she said. You adjusted. You came into this morning with a complete picture of who you were and what you were capable of, and you let the day change that picture. She paused. Some of you needed more convincing than others. A quiet sound, almost a laugh, moved through the group. Almost. That's not a criticism, she said. Conviction is a tool. You need it. The problem is when conviction becomes a ceiling instead of a foundation. When being certain you're right becomes more important than finding out what's true. She looked at Hollis, not pointedly, just honestly. The best shooters I have ever worked with had one thing in common. They were always more interested in what they didn't know than in what they did. Hollis met her eyes. He didn't look away. Tomorrow, she said, we go further. Distance, conditions, and a component we haven't discussed yet. Tonight, I want you to sit with what you experienced today, not the shots, not the technique. The moment when you stopped protecting yourself and just did the work. Find that moment. Remember what it felt like. Because tomorrow, that feeling is the only tool that's going to matter. She picked up the folded jacket. She held it for a moment, not putting it on yet, just holding it, the duct tape visible on the shoulder panel, the collar where the fabric had separated and been pressed back together with nothing more sophisticated than hardware store adhesive. One more thing, she said, and her voice had shifted, not louder, not softer, but into a register that had weight to it, the weight of something said because it needed to be said rather than because it had been planned. The jacket. She held it up slightly, not for display, just in acknowledgement. It belonged to a teammate. He wore it for 11 months in 3 different theaters. He gave it to me the last time I saw him. She lowered it. I keep it repaired because throwing it away is not something I'm able to do. Nobody made a sound. That's all for today, she said. Get some sleep. She put the jacket back on. The duct tape caught the orange light. She walked off the range without looking back, notebook under her arm, the bone frog disappearing into the shadow of the sleeve. And the recruits who had been laughing at that jacket 12 hours earlier sat in the quiet of the Nevada evening and said nothing for a long time. Hollis was the last one still sitting when the light finally went. He was looking at the place where the targets waited in the dark at 1,140 yards, invisible now, but there, still waiting. He thought about what was in the way this morning. He thought about what he'd said to her. He thought about 1,140 yards and what that distance meant when it mattered. He thought about a teammate's jacket held together with tape. He sat with it, all of it. Because some days are just training days. And some days are the day before you understand what you're actually training for. And the difference between the two is not always visible until you're already inside one of them. This had been the second kind of day, and he did not yet know that tomorrow would be harder. He didn't sleep. Hollis lay on his bunk in the Fort Fallon barracks with his eyes open and the ceiling above him doing nothing useful. And he thought about the jacket. He thought about the teammate who had worn it for 11 months across 3 theaters. He thought about what it meant that she kept it repaired instead of replacing it and what it cost her every morning to put it on. And whether the cost was the point, whether carrying that weight deliberately was the way she kept the memory honest instead of comfortable. He thought about what she had said, that the best shooters she'd worked with were always more interested in what they didn't know than in what they did. He had spent 6 years being certain, 6 years building a reputation, stacking records, collecting evidence of his own exceptionalism, like a man preparing a legal case for his own defense. And it had worked. He had been good. He was still good. But there was a difference he understood now between being good and being ready, between performing well under conditions you could control and performing when control was the first thing taken from you. He didn't know if he was ready, and that not knowing, which would have felt like failure yesterday, felt today like the first honest thing he had known about himself in a long time. Rourke was awake too in the bunk across the aisle. Hollis could tell by the quality of his breathing, the slight unevenness that meant a mind running too fast for the body to follow into sleep. You reading the tattoo over and over too, Hollis said into the dark. A pause. We hold the line, Rourke said quietly. Yeah. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. The three words sat in the dark barracks room the way certain truths sit, not demanding anything, just present, taking up the space they had earned. Morning came hard and early in the way Nevada mornings come, without apology, without transition, just suddenly light where there had been dark and heat already building, where the night had briefly allowed coolness. She was on the range before any of them. When the first recruits arrived at 6:45, she was already there, standing in the same spot by the equipment crates, same jacket, same stillness. The coffee cup was back in her hands. Hollis wondered if she'd slept at all. He suspected the answer was the same as his, and for different reasons that were probably worse. She didn't greet them. She didn't do morning announcements or warm them up with conversation. She watched them assemble, counted them with her eyes, and said, "Yesterday was orientation. Today is the actual test." Torres, pulling on his gloves, looked up. "What's different today?" "Yesterday I needed to know what you could do," she said. "Today I need to know what you do when you think you've already failed." The morning began, and it was harder than the day before in ways that were difficult to categorize as physical or psychological, because they were neither separately, they were both simultaneously, the way real operational stress never separates the body from the mind, but forces them to fail together or hold together. And the choice between those two outcomes is made in a place that no training manual has ever successfully located. She ran them through a new sequence. Long-range shooting after sleep deprivation simulation, a 45-minute stress protocol at 5 in the morning that none of them had been told about, which meant they had technically slept, but had slept with the compressed, insufficient quality of people who knew something was coming without knowing what. She had designed it that way deliberately, because the worst conditions in the field weren't the ones you were briefed on. They were the ones that arrived without scheduling. Hollis got behind his rifle at the 1,400-yard line and found that his hands were slightly less cooperative than yesterday. Not unreliable, just noticeably human in a way they hadn't felt during peak performance. He made the adjustment in his position, breathed, and found the place he'd found at the end of yesterday, the quiet place. The one that wasn't about protecting anything, just about doing the work. He fired. High by 3 inches at 1,400 yards. Not a miss in most definitions, a miss in hers. She was behind him. You compensated for the wind before it shifted instead of after. You anticipated instead of responding. Felt like it was about to move, he said. Feeling is data, she said, but it's a hypothesis, not a fact. Fire the hypothesis, confirm with the result, adjust. Don't commit to the hypothesis before the data. He processed that, reloaded, waited. The wind shifted. She had known it would, had seen it in the thermals, in the pressure, in things she read the way other people read text. He felt it touch his neck. He adjusted. He fired. Center. There, she said, and moved on. By 9 in the morning, the exercise had produced something unexpected. It had produced failure repeatedly and publicly from some of the recruits who had performed the best yesterday. Not because they had gotten worse, but because the conditions were genuinely harder, and because genuine difficulty has a way of reaching past skill into something more fundamental. Into the question of why you're here and whether the reason is strong enough to hold when the performance stops being clean. Alvarez put 4 rounds at 1,300 yards and didn't hit clean on any of them. He came off the rifle breathing harder than the exertion required, jaw-tight eyes, doing the thing eyes do when a person is arguing with themselves internally at full volume. She crouched beside him. "What's happening?" "I don't know," he said. "I can't. Yesterday it was there today. It's like I'm shooting in a different body." "You are," she said. "The body you had yesterday had 7 hours of prep and a morning coffee, and it was the first day. The body you have today is tired and pressured and aware that someone is evaluating it. That's the real body. That's the one that goes to work." He looked at her. His eyes were frustrated, raw. "How do I get it back?" "You don't get it back," she said. "There's nothing to get back. Yesterday isn't available. You have to find what works in this body on this day in these conditions. That's different from what worked yesterday, and the sooner you stop looking for yesterday's answer, the sooner you find today's." He stared at her. He was looking for something in what she'd said, something to be angry at, something to push against, because anger was easier than what she was actually describing. But there was nothing to be angry at. The statement was just true, and the truth of it sat on his chest with the full weight of an uncomfortable reality. He got back behind the rifle. He fired. Still not perfect. Better. And better on a day like this one was everything. Mitchell arrived at 10:30. He walked the line quietly observing without commenting the way he did when the real evaluation, the one that mattered for operational decisions, was happening. The recruits felt it. The quality of attention sharpened. Everything got slightly more deliberate. At 11:15, Mitchell stopped at the center of the range and asked her quietly in a register just below what the recruits could fully hear. "Today." She said something back. He nodded once. He raised his voice. "Take 10. Water and shade." The recruits pulled back. She remained at the firing line looking downrange. Mitchell stood beside her. Hollis, drinking water 15 feet away, watched them. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see the posture: Mitchell with his arms crossed, listening, and her speaking with the notebook open in her left hand, pointing at something on the page. Not at the range. At the page. Numbers, coordinates, something that wasn't about today's exercise. Rourke materialized beside him. "That's not a debrief," Rourke said quietly. "No," Hollis agreed. "That's planning." Hollis looked at him. Rourke was watching Mitchell's face, the slight hardening around the eyes, the way his jaw shifted when he was processing something with real operational weight. "She's briefing him on something," Rourke said. "Or he's briefing her. Either way, it's not about our shooting scores." Hollis looked back at the two of them. Miller had closed the notebook. She was looking at the ground for a moment, that specific kind of looking at nothing. That means someone is running through a sequence in their head, checking variables, confirming calculations. Then she looked up and said something short and certain, and Mitchell nodded, and it was over. She turned back to the recruits. "Back on the line," she said. Nobody asked what the conversation had been, but everyone had clocked it. The afternoon brought something new. She set up a scenario, a simulation with targets representing a hostage position, a threat position, and two collateral positions that could not be hit under any circumstances. She gave them a brief. She gave them wind data that was accurate for the first 8 minutes, and then changed it without telling them, the way wind changes in the field without telling anyone. She gave them a spotter, but restricted the spotter's communication to 3 words per minute. She gave them a time window, and then she sat behind them, silent, and watched. What happened in the next 40 minutes was the most honest assessment of who these men actually were that the entire 2-day evaluation had produced. Because what the scenario revealed was not skill level. Skill levels had been established. What it revealed was decision-making under compound uncertainty, what a person does when multiple things are wrong simultaneously, and the cost of waiting to be sure is as high as the cost of being wrong. Torres performed brilliantly. He was slower than some, but every decision he made was traceable. He could explain each one in real time, which meant he was not guessing, but reasoning. And reasoning under pressure is a different animal from guessing under pressure, even when they look similar from the outside. Rourke performed the way Hollis had suspected he would since the morning of day 1, with a kind of quiet mastery that didn't announce itself. He hit what he needed to hit. He didn't hit what he couldn't hit. He communicated with his spotter in the stripped, efficient language of someone who had been doing this long enough that words were a resource to be conserved. Hollis performed well, better than the morning. Not perfectly. On his third simulated engagement, he hesitated 1 full second of hesitation on a time-critical shot, and the target moved in the simulation and the window closed. He came off the rifle, and he knew what had happened before she said anything. "You had it," she said. "I know. What stopped you?" He thought about it, really thought about it, because she deserved a real answer, and he was starting to want to give real answers as a practice rather than an exception. "I was second-guessing the wind data," he said. "I knew it had shifted. I wasn't sure how much. I wanted to be sure before I committed. And instead, I had neither." She was quiet for a moment. "Then in Yemen 2019, I had a window of approximately 4 seconds. The wind was running at conditions I couldn't fully measure because the equipment was compromised. The dust storm had cut visibility to near zero in the overwatch position. I had one data point, the feel of the pressure on my face, and a single glimpse of the target through a gap in the sand that lasted less than 2 seconds. She paused. I did not have enough information to be certain. Nobody spoke. "I took the shot anyway," she said, "because the alternative to taking an imperfect shot was not a better shot. The alternative was no shot. And no shot was 11 members of a DevGru assault element getting killed by a heavy machine gun position they couldn't suppress. She looked at Hollis. Certainty is a luxury. In the field, you trade it for timing. You take the best shot you can with the information you have at the moment you have it, and you live with whatever comes next. Hollis looked at her. He looked at her with the specific kind of attention a person gives when they understand they are receiving something they will carry for the rest of their life, and they want to make sure they receive it correctly. "Were you scared?" he asked. The question came out before he decided to ask it. He wasn't sure it was appropriate. He wasn't sure anything about the last 48 hours fit into categories like appropriate anymore. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she gave him something rare, something you could tell from the quality of her stillness as she decided to give it was genuinely rare. "I was terrified," she said. "My hands were shaking, not from cold. The nerve damage in my left arm was firing in a way that felt like the arm didn't belong to me. I had lost a significant amount of blood from a shrapnel wound I hadn't stopped to treat. I was lying in a sandstorm alone with a rifle I wasn't sure had survived the explosion that got me to that position." She said it all in the same level, unhurried voice she used for everything. Not dramatic, not performed, just true. "And I took the shot. Nobody moved. Not a recruit, not Mitchell, not the wind. Because the team was downrange," she said, "and that was sufficient reason." Rourke looked at his hands. He looked at them for a long time. Alvarez said very quietly, "The shot that saved the mission." "Shots don't save missions," she said. "People do. The shot was the mechanism. The decision was the thing." She looked across the group. "You will each in your career reach a moment where you have to make a decision with insufficient information under maximum pressure with real consequences for real people. Your technique will be less relevant in that moment than everything you know about yourself, about who you are when there's nothing left to protect." She paused. "Today has been about finding out if you know that person yet." Mitchell spoke for the first time in hours. "Debrief at 1700, he said. "Individual assessments. Be there." The recruits dispersed. She walked back toward the equipment crates. She picked up her notebook, opened it to a fresh page, and stood writing for several minutes. Observations, assessments, the accumulated picture of 2 days of watching these men operate. She wrote quickly in the compressed shorthand of someone for whom precision of language is as trained as precision of fire. Hollis approached her from the side. She didn't look up. "The window I missed," he said. "The hesitation." "Yes. Would you have taken it?" She looked up from the notebook. She considered him not to question him in that direct measuring way she had. "Yes," she said, "but that's not the relevant answer." "What is?" "Whether you would have taken it for the right reason." She looked back at the notebook. "Missing because you were afraid is different from missing because you weren't ready. One of those you can fix. The other one fixes itself when you have been downrange enough times." She turned the page. "Which one was yours today?" He thought about it. He gave it the full weight it deserved. "Fear," he said, "not of missing, of being wrong." "Of being wrong," she repeated. "Yeah." She wrote something in the notebook. He couldn't see what. "That's the honest answer," she said. "Most people give me the other, Tim." "The other one is easier," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." She closed the notebook. She looked at him directly. "Fear of being wrong isn't a weakness, Hollis. It's information. It tells you where your edge is. The job is not to eliminate it. The job is to act correctly in spite of it every time until action in spite of fear becomes the same as courage, which is the only definition of courage that actually works in the field." He was quiet for a moment. He was doing that thing he'd started doing yesterday, receiving something carefully instead of deflecting it. "Is that what Yemen was?" he asked. "Courage." She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was going orange again. Same as yesterday, the same daily transformation of Nevada into something almost beautiful. The bone frog on her forearm, the surgical scar on her bicep, the burn mark on the right arm that she never mentioned and never explained. "Yemen was a choice," she said finally, "made under impossible conditions for the only reason that ever holds up when you look back at it." She picked up the jacket from the equipment crate. Because the people downrange needed someone to hold the line. She put the jacket on, slowly accommodating the shoulder, the duct tape on the collar, the repaired seam, the fabric that had spent 11 months with someone who wasn't here anymore. She walked toward the briefing area without looking back, and Hollis stood in the orange Nevada light with the specific weight of the last 2 days on him, understanding something he hadn't understood at 6 in the morning, the day before when he had poured her coffee into the dirt at her feet and laughed. Understanding was not the same as absolution. He knew that. The understanding didn't erase what he'd done, or what he'd said, or who he'd been in those first hours. But it was the beginning of something. The beginning of the kind of man who doesn't need to be the loudest voice in the room to be certain of who he is. The kind of man who can sit with not knowing and still move forward. He walked toward the briefing area. The individual assessments awaited. The scores, the feedback, the formal language of evaluation. But he already knew the only score that mattered was the one she had been keeping in that notebook since the moment she arrived. Not a measure of his shooting, but a measure of his capacity to become someone worth putting down range when it mattered. Whether he had passed that assessment, he did not know. He walked toward the answer. The briefing room at Fort Fallon was not a comfortable place. It had been designed to be functional, not forgiving metal folding chairs, a long table, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they hadn't slept in several days, which by this point was accurate. The recruits filed in at 1700 hours with the particular posture of people who had spent 2 days being stripped of assumptions and were now waiting to find out what the formal accounting looked like. Miller sat at the front of the table, not beside Mitchell, not deferring to the side. At the front, her notebook was open, her jacket was on. The duct tape on the shoulder caught the fluorescent light exactly the way it had caught the Nevada sun, with the same indifference to context, the same refusal to apologize for what it was. Mitchell stood against the wall to her right. He had the look of a man who had already read the outcome and was waiting for everyone else to arrive at it. She looked at the recruits as they settled, one by one, the same way she had looked at the targets all morning, measuring, cataloging, processing. She gave nobody special treatment with her eyes. Everyone got the same direct attention and the same economy of expression. Individual assessments, she said. I'll be direct. Some of you will not like what I say. If that's a problem, figure out why it's a problem, because that answer is more useful than anything I'm about to tell you. She started with Torres. She told him he was technically gifted, that his breath control had improved more in 2 days than most shooters improve in 2 months, and that the gap in his performance was target prioritization under time pressure. That when forced to choose quickly between 2 engagement options, he defaulted to the safer choice rather than the correct one. Safer and correct are different things, she said. Learn to tell them apart in real time. Torres nodded slowly. He was writing something on a small card he'd pulled from his chest pocket. Not notes on her feedback. She could see from the angle that he was writing it verbatim, as if he needed to be able to read it later. She worked through the group, Alvarez's excellent instincts, poor confidence, management prone to catastrophizing a single miss into a narrative about his overall capability. One bad shot is data. It's not identity. Stop using it as identity. Kim, technically sound, communicated poorly with his spotter, needed to understand that the spotter relationship was not a hierarchy, but a partnership. The best shot of your career might come from information your spotter gives you in the last second. Make sure he wants to give it to you. Each assessment was delivered the same way, direct, specific, without cushioning, but also without cruelty. The difference between a hard truth delivered with respect and the same truth delivered as a weapon is not the content. It's the intention behind the delivery. Hers was always the same, not to diminish, but to locate, to find the exact place where the work needed to happen and name it precisely enough that the person could find it again on their own. She came to Rourke. He sat straight, hands flat on the table, the posture of a man who has decided to receive whatever comes without flinching. Rourke, she said, Senior Chief, you are the best natural shooter in this group, she said, by a margin that is not close. Something moved through the room, not jealousy exactly, more like the collective recognition of an honest statement that everyone had privately known and nobody had said. The limitation is not technique, she continued. The limitation is that you operate in isolation by instinct. You make your best decisions alone, which means you make your worst decisions in a team, because the team slows down a process you have been running solo since you were 12 years old in Montana. She held his eyes. The operation you're being considered for requires a spotter-sniper relationship that functions under fire in degraded conditions, with communication restricted and trust at maximum. You can make the shot. The question is whether you can make it with someone beside you. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Then who's the spotter? A pause, clean and deliberate. That depends on whether certain people in this room are selected, she said, and she moved on. That sentence landed and did not leave. It stayed in the room like smoke without a specific source present and unresolved. Then she came to Hollis. He sat in the second chair from her left. He had his hands in his lap. He wasn't performing anything. He was just present, which was, she had noted, the most significant change she had observed in 2 days. Not his shooting, which had improved. His presence. The way he inhabited a space had shifted from occupation to attention. He was listening now with his whole body instead of just the parts of it that confirmed what he already believed. Hollis, she said, Senior Chief, you are one of the most technically accomplished shooters I have evaluated in 8 years of running these assessments, she said. And the way she said it, flat informational, not as a compliment, but as a measurement, made it more valuable than any compliment would have been. He said nothing. The problem is not, and has never been, ability, she said. The problem is what the ability has been in service of. She paused. For most of your career, your shooting has been in service of being Derek Hollis, the record, the reputation, the person other people know about. That's not the same as being in service of the mission. And the difference between those two things downrange is the difference between a shooter and a weapon. The room was completely still. Yesterday morning, she said, you told me my data was wrong and that my jacket told you everything you needed to know about what table I was sitting at. He held her eyes. He did not look away. Yes, he said. And then you applied my correction and hit center, she said. Yes. Why did you apply it? He thought about that. Because I knew you were right, he said. Even when I was saying you weren't. I knew. And you applied it anyway. Yeah. That, she said, is the thing that matters. Not that you were wrong about me. Being wrong about people is human. What matters is that when the evidence contradicted your position, you adjusted. You didn't dig in. You didn't double down. You took the information and you used it. She leaned forward slightly. That is the difference between a man who can be taught and a man who can't. And I have met more of the second kind than you would believe. Hollis exhaled slowly. Not relief. Something heavier and more honest than relief. The exhale of someone setting down a weight they had been carrying at the cost of considerable energy. So where does that leave me? He asked. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, it leaves you in consideration for Africa. The room shifted. Not visibly, nobody moved, but the pressure changed the way pressure changes before weather, and everyone felt it. Africa, Torres said. He said it carefully, like a word he was making sure he understood the weight of before he picked it up. Mitchell stepped forward from the wall. He looked at the group with the expression he wore when the operational reality was about to replace the training context entirely. What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room, he said. Any of you, under any circumstances. What you hear in the next 10 minutes is classified at the level of your current clearances, and you will not discuss it, write it, or reference it outside of briefings in authorized environments. Do you understand? The answer was unanimous and immediate. He looked at Miller. She opened the notebook to the page she had been working on during her quiet moment after the afternoon exercise, the page with the numbers and coordinates that Hollis and Rourke had watched her show Mitchell during the water break. There is a JSOC operation being planned for execution in approximately 6 weeks, Mitchell said. Location, Northern Sub-Saharan Africa. Objective, hostage rescue. American civilian NGO worker held by a splinter cell with confirmed connections to regional terror networks. The intelligence window is narrow. The operation has one viable execution approach. He paused. A single sniper in the spotter team capable of making an engagement at approximately 1,850 yards under unstable field conditions. High wind variance, thermal distortion, potential for dust interference in a time window estimated at less than 90 seconds. Silence. 1850, Rourke said quietly. He wasn't expressing doubt. He was doing arithmetic. 1850, Mitchell confirmed. With a hostage in proximity, Miller added. The threat position is approximately 4 meters from the hostage. The margin for error at that distance is measured in centimeters. Alvarez said what everyone was thinking. That's not a shot, that's a miracle. It's a shot, Miller said. Her voice was so flat and certain it cut through the room like a line drawn in stone. I have made a harder one. Nobody argued with that. Nobody in that room after 2 days was going to argue with that. The sniper position has been identified, she continued. The approach route has been established. What doesn't exist yet is the team. She looked at the recruits one by one. A team with the technical capability, the communication discipline, and the psychological profile to execute under those conditions without losing the hostage. What's the psychological profile? Torres asked. Someone who can take an imperfect shot at the right moment, she said, rather than a perfect shot at the wrong one. She looked at Hollis when she said it. Not pointedly, just accurately. He felt it land. He didn't move. Then something happened that nobody in the room had anticipated, something that changed the architecture of the entire 2 days retroactively, the way a revelation at the end of a story changes the meaning of everything that came before it. Miller closed the notebook. She set it on the table in front of her. She looked at Hollis with an expression that had crossed into territory her face hadn't occupied at any point during the evaluation, not in the corrections, not in the debrief, not even when she talked about Yemen. This was something older, something that had been in the room since the beginning and had been waiting patiently for the right moment to surface. Hollis, she said, I need to ask you something and I need you to think carefully before you answer. He straightened slightly. Okay. Do you remember a counter-sniper engagement in the Kandahar province? She said in 2021, March. A patrol that took fire from an elevated position on the eastern ridge. 4 men pinned in an exposed courtyard. The threat was suppressed from an unknown position. No one claimed the shot. The patrol got out. He went still. Completely still. The kind of stillness that isn't calm, but the opposite of calm, every system in the body suddenly running at full capacity and producing nothing visible on the surface, because the surface has been trained to hold. I was on that patrol, he said. His voice was careful, measured in a way that meant something was moving under it at speed. I was one of the 4 men in the courtyard. Yes, she said, I know. The room had stopped breathing. The shot came from the north, he said. We never found the position. Command said it was probably a tribal militia engagement that happened to work in our favor. It wasn't, she said. He looked at her. He looked at her the way you look at someone when the ground has moved so completely that you need to find something fixed to orient to, and the only fixed thing available is the person in front of you. That was you, he said. JSOC had intelligence on the threat position 24 hours before your patrol went out, she said. The operation I was running didn't allow for a formal coordination loop. I was in the area. I saw the patrol take contact. I had the shot. She held his eyes. So I took it. Hollis said nothing. He was doing something with his face that men who have been trained to manage their expressions do when the management fails. Not because the training failed, but because what they're feeling is simply larger than the container. His eyes were bright, not wet. Bright, the brightness of someone processing something at a speed that the body registers as physical. You never told anyone, he said. No. Why, ma? Because it wasn't my operation, she said simply. The credit wasn't mine to take. The mission was already ongoing. You weren't part of it. You were just there in the way of something that was going to happen to you. She paused. So I removed the thing that was going to happen to you, and then I went back to work. Rourke, 2 seats down, had his hand over his mouth. Not to cover an expression, just to give himself a second. Because what he had just heard was not a story about a sniper making a shot. It was a story about a person who had saved 4 lives and then gone back to silence without stopping to receive anything for it. Without a record, without a recognition, without even a moment of being known. We hold the line. He understood finally completely what those 3 words meant. Not as a motto, as a practice, as a daily deliberate choice to be the person standing between others and the thing coming for them without requiring the others to know you were there. Hollis looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. His voice, when he found it, was quiet and stripped of everything performative. No Ranger bravado, no record, no history of being exceptional. Just a man. You saved my life, he said. And then 3 years later, I poured your coffee in the dirt and told you that you didn't belong on my range. Yes, she said. And you didn't say anything. No, Titu. Why didn't you say anything? She looked at him steadily. Because it wasn't relevant to the evaluation, she said. What happened in Kandahar doesn't change whether you're ready for Africa. Your shooting changes that. Your attitude changes that. Who you are when you don't know you're being watched, that changes it. She paused, and I needed to see who that person was. Not the person who knew he owed me something. The person who didn't know. The silence that followed was the most complete silence the room had produced in 2 days. It had weight and texture, and the particular quality of silence that comes after something true has been said. Not comfortable, not resolved, but honest in a way that makes everything else in the room slightly more honest by proximity. Hollis pushed his chair back. He stood up. He was not performing anything. He was not making a gesture. He was simply a man who had run out of ways to sit still in the presence of the debt he was carrying, and standing was the only option that didn't feel like lying. "I'm stepping forward for Africa," he said. His voice was level, not loud, not announced, just certain. The certainty of someone who has finally stopped making decisions from a position of self-protection and started making them from something deeper and more durable. Not because I owe you, because I'm ready. And because whatever's downrange in Africa deserves someone who learned what I learned in the last 2 days. She looked at him. Those same measuring eyes, running the calculation one more time as she always did, as she would always do, because the calculation was never finished until the mission was over and everyone was home. Then she looked at Rourke. "If Hollis is the shooter," she said, "I want you as spotter." Rourke looked at Hollis. Hollis looked at Rourke. Between them passed the specific kind of communication that happens between two people who have spent 48 hours in close proximity to something real and have arrived on the other side of it, changed in compatible ways. "Yeah," Rourke said. "Okay." She looked at Mitchell. He nodded. One single nod that closed the operational question and opened everything that came next. The planning, the preparation, the classified corridors of a mission that would be executed 6 weeks from now, in a country these men had never been to, under conditions they were not yet fully briefed on, with a shot that most people in the world would call impossible. She picked up the notebook. She stood. She picked up the folded jacket from the table beside her, and she held it for a moment, the duct tape, the repaired seam, the 11 months of a person she carried in the fabric. And then she put it on slowly, the left shoulder first. "We start pre-mission preparation Monday," she said. "Between now and then, I want both of you running the 1850 calculation independently. Don't compare notes yet. I want to see where your math lands before I show you the environmental data." She looked at the rest of the group. "The others will continue with Captain Mitchell. Your evaluations will go into the next selection pool. What you learned here is not wasted. Nothing learned at this level is wasted." She looked at them all one final time, not with warmth. Warmth was not the register she operated in, but with something that had been building since the first corrections at the 1,000-yard line, something that looked in its full expression very much like respect. "You showed up," she said, "both days, even when it was hard, even when you failed. You showed up and you adjusted and you tried again. That's the entire job. Everything else is detail." She walked toward the door. Hollis watched her go, the jacket that duct taped the walk that accommodated the shoulder without drawing attention to it, the notebook under her arm with 2 days of honest observation written in compressed shorthand. At the door, she stopped. She didn't turn around. She said without looking back, "Hollis, Senior Chief, you belong on the range," she said. "You always did." She walked out. The door closed behind her. Nobody spoke for a long time. The fluorescent light ran its indifferent hum. Outside, the Nevada dark had come down completely, and the range where the steel had rung and rung and rung through 2 days of learning was quiet and invisible, under a sky full of stars that didn't know about any of it and shone anyway. Hollis sat back down. He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at the grain of the metal surface, and he breathed slowly all the way in and all the way out, the way she had taught Torres, and through Torres taught all of them. Exhale first, everything else second. Rourke sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Rourke said quietly, 1850. "Yeah," Hollis said. "We're going to make it," Rourke said. Not as a question, not as bravado, as a statement of operational intent made by a man who had found in the last 2 days the ground beneath his own feet and intended to stand on it. "Yeah," Hollis said again, "we are." Outside, somewhere on the access road, an engine started. Headlights moved across the dark desert. A woman in a duct-taped jacket drove toward the highway, her notebook on the seat beside her, already thinking about Monday, about 1,850 yards, about a hostage who didn't know her name and never would, about the line that needed to be held and the people willing to hold it in the long, quiet work of making sure that when the moment came, the shot was ready before the moment arrived. She had done this before. She would do it again. Not because anyone asked her to, not because anyone would know, but because the line did not hold itself and someone had to stand in the space between what was coming and the people it was coming for. And she had decided a long time ago in a different desert with sand in her eyes and blood on her hands and a rifle she wasn't sure would fire that she was someone who stood there. She had been the Wraith. She had been Senior Chief Petty Officer Cassidy Miller. She had been the woman in the torn jacket that nobody took seriously until the steel rang and the silence came down and the truth announced itself the way truth always announces itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the clean, irrefutable sound of something hitting exactly where it was aimed. She drove into the dark. The stars held their positions. The desert held its silence. And somewhere behind her, two men sat in a fluorescent room and began quietly to prepare for the most important shot either of them would ever take, guided by the hand of a woman who had already taken harder ones and had never once asked to be thanked for it. That was the line, and it was held.